Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Morning Star Experience. Morning Star is an experience committed to the mission of Jesus Christ, resulting in transformed lives, effective disciples, empowered communities, and of course, authentic worship. Tonight, we have something special in store for you. A conversation, a dialogue, a panel on police reform that we believe our faith will be not only be informative for you, but also empowering and encouraging at the same time to let you know that God does have a plan for his people. Even before we begin this evening, I want to open with a word of prayer. Gracious God, our Father, we thank you tonight for your presence. We thank you for your process and the purpose you give to all of us. Even tonight, God, open up our minds, our hearts, our spirits, that we can receive from God those persons you have called into our midst this evening, persons who will challenge us, persons who will inform us, persons who will empower us. So God, tonight, give us open ears and let those who have an ear hear what the Spirit has to say. It's in the name of Jesus Christ we pray, and together we say, amen. Again, good evening to everybody. So glad that so many persons are sharing this evening on YouTube, on Facebook, on our website. We're thanking God for you, that you have the determination to receive information that will strengthen, that will empower you, give you information that you can run this race, live this journey in the will of God with a plan that God releases to you through his people. Again, tonight we are in for a major treat, Morning Star friends and family. God has given us the opportunity to cross paths with persons who are insightful, who are intelligent, and who have a path that they're going to share with us in this particular area. Tonight is my pleasure to introduce our moderator who's going to guide us through this evening. She's well known throughout this community, well known throughout this country, this world. She's Dr. Maya Rockeymoore Cummings. He is the founder, the president, CEO of Global Policy Solutions, LLC. She's a gardener. She's a pet owner. She's an accomplished speaker. She is an analyst and advisor. She wears so many hats and wears them all so well. And we're just excited that she's able to spend some time with us tonight to guide us through this discussion. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to this expert in so many fields, Dr. Maya Rockeymoore Cummings. That's in your hands.
Thank you, Bishop Debnam. Now, let me just say, talking about hats that you wear well, I have been to your church and I have heard your preaching, and I just know that you lead your flock quite well, and I have benefited, as so many others have, from your God-given wisdom and certainly for your gifts. And so thank you for your leadership. Thank you for caring about educating the community and making sure that you do solid education and outreach to the community. And I consider this forum, Am I My Brother's Keeper, a police reform forum, one of the very important things that you do to extend the reach of Morning Star out into the greater Baltimore community. So thank you so much for your leadership.
Thank you. Thank you.
And you know, this is a fraught moment that we're in. The African-American community is really in a catch-22 when it comes to policing, when you think about it. On the one hand, African-American communities, just like any other communities, need good policing to promote community safety and well-being. And additionally, we have traditionally embraced community policing because it's a pathway to good careers with good paying jobs and benefits for African Americans. And so, it's a solid pathway to the middle class. But on the other hand, African American communities have too often been over-policed. I do think that it was Huey P. Newton who once said that police are an occupying army in the Black community. And so we certainly have that sentiment that's out there. And of course, who can, ignore the instances of police brutality, and certainly the steady stream of roadside and street corner police-involved shootings of Black and brown men especially. But it's important to note, not exclusively. Women have been, of course, the victims as well. Over the last few years and decades, has caused long-standing tensions to boil over in recent years. So, if we're just looking at 2020 being the high watermark with George Floyd dying under the knee of Derek Chauvin, and that leading to protests, not just in the state in which it occurred, but all across the country and around the world, and not just among African Americans, but among people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, of every income level, from every walk of life. We have reached a moment in time where it's truly an inflection point. One where we actually have to come to grips about not only where we are, but where we're headed as a community, where we're headed as a country, and certainly here in Maryland, where we're headed as a state. So I am just delighted that we have some terrific experts who are here today to talk about the issue of policing, what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, what the history has been, and certainly where we're going in our future. And I'd like to welcome this stellar panel that we have, starting with ladies first, Dr. Carla Debnam. She is the spouse of Bishop Dwayne Dednam and a member of Morning Star Baptist Church. She has a Master's of Science degree in Pastoral Counseling from Loyola University of Maryland and a Doctor of Ministry degree in Transformational Leadership from the Ashland Theological Seminary in Ashland, Ohio. She is a national certified counselor and a licensed clinical professional counselor in Maryland, and she serves as the executive director of the Renaissance Center, a Christian counseling center and outreach ministry of Morning Star Baptist Church. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We are also joined by Dr. Lorenzo M. Boyd. He is a nationally recognized expert in police community relations and an authority on urban policing. Dr. Boyd currently serves as the Stewart Professor of Criminal Justice and Community Policing at the University of New Haven. He formerly served as the university's Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and former Director for the Center of Advanced Policing. His 14-year service as a deputy sheriff in Boston informs his 20-year career in higher education. And he certainly combines all of that to make him a very highly sought after consultant, trainer, and speaker for departments and communities across the country. Welcome, Dr. Boyd.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Next, I would like to welcome Captain Orlando D. Lilly, someone I have seen quite often in my own church, I believe, New Psalmist Baptist Church. He serves in the Baltimore County Police Department and is currently assigned to the 2nd Precinct in Woodlawn. He has been a member of the agency for 27 years. He was previously assigned as the Precinct Commander of Youth Community Service Section, the Recruitment Unit, and the Precinct Commander of the 12th Precinct in Dundalk for 3 years. He has been an adjunct professor at the University of Baltimore in the Forensic Science Department and previously at the Baltimore County Community College, where he taught ethics and diversity in the Criminal Justice Department. I should just also add that he has received his Master's of Science in Management from the Johns Hopkins University and a Bachelor's from the University of Baltimore in Criminal Justice. Welcome, Captain.
Hello, thank you all.
All right, and last but certainly not least is Senator Charles E. Sydnor III. Born and raised in Baltimore City, Senator Sydnor is a proud resident of Ellicott Mills community. He was recently sworn into the Maryland Senate on January 8th, 2020 to represent District 44, which includes communities in both Baltimore City and Baltimore County. And actually, that's my district. He serves on the Judicial Proceedings Committee. Additionally, he was appointed to the Joint Committee on Children, Youth, and Families, the Joint Committee on Ending Homelessness, and the Maryland State Commission on Criminal Sentencing Policy. His day job is that he works as an Assistant General Counsel with the Columbia, Maryland-based affordable housing organization, Enterprise Community Investment Incorporated. So welcome, Senator Sydnor. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much and good evening.
Now, I don't believe that I've missed anybody. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just basically set the terms for our discussion. I will be encouraging us. I might direct a question at an individual, but I encourage anybody who has a thought or something that they want to add or even question to insert themselves at any point in time. This is not just a two-way discussion. This is a multi-way discussion. We will be bringing in questions from the audience as we go along, as appropriate, but I want this to be a conversation, okay? So I encourage you to actually engage in dialogue. I would also like to say that, if you feel so urgently that you want to insert yourself, even as somebody is, landing the plane in terms of their conversation, feel free to assert yourself in that way as well. If you disagree, go ahead and disagree. That's okay. We have many perspectives when it comes to policing in the African American community. But what I would like to do is start off by asking you to open up with a 3-minute short, brief statement about where you think we are now. We certainly have, rising crime rates across the country. We've come off of some major protests around police brutality and the shootings, police-involved shootings. And we certainly have had here in the state of Maryland, certainly a lot of tensions here in the Baltimore County, Baltimore City region, and with the state legislature doing some police reform work. So I'd like to just start with ladies first, Dr. Debnam.
Hi, this is an honor and a privilege. And in my perspective, as far as we are in the community, we have a lot of, work to do. And my work in the criminal justice system is on the mental health side. And we were privileged to do some, pre-release training for some of the men that were incarcerated on their way out. And so seeing that the need for more, connections in the community, of course, before people get in the law enforcement loop, but also as they re-enter. And so from my point of view, the community response to this is very crucial. And the church in particular, I believe, plays an important role in making sure that our citizens are protected and also given a fair shot at justice. And so some of my interest in it is from the mental health standpoint and making sure persons aren't living in fear of, being pulled over, being in fear of just not being treated fairly if they do have an encounter for some reason, with the police department. And so having been, having to write letters, supporting persons that are involved in cases or just even hosting, as we have done, expungement fairs and job fairs for returning citizens. These are some of the things that I think are important. But if we can prevent, persons from being in the system, that is even better. And so that's really what I feel like we need to try to prevent people getting caught up. And some of that is addressing the health, mental health, and financial disparities, just different things that lead people to make choices that, may be harmful to themselves or to others.
So prevention is key. Captain Lilly, can you share where you think we are in this moment in time with regards to policing in the African American community?
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to say two things. One, I'm going to put in a very layman's term of the hamster wheel. And I say that out of the context because we can go back to the Kerner's Commission, as well as so many, the Wickersham Commission. And every time we had the 21st century policing, and we keep revisiting these cycles of crisis in policing. And so I think we're at a place now where we're starting to try to really dive into what I would consider to be this intellectual empathy versus this intellectual narrow-mindedness when it comes to policing, and how we now can kind of navigate the landscape to move from a place of trying to deal with this issue emotionally, but then trying to actually put down some things that are very concrete and move it away so much from the focus of just the profession in itself, as if the profession is made up of individuals and people who come from their own ecosystems in society, and it actually influences a lot of the decision makings that we see in the profession. And so I think we're at a place where we now have to realize that the evolution of the profession requires a much more high level of thinking to actually do the work, as well as think about how we can kind of move forward with people that we serve at the same time.
All right. Intellectual empathy versus intellectual narrow-mindedness. We're going to get into that, as I'm looking forward to it. Dr. Boyd, where are we at this moment in time, in your opinion?
Before we talk about where we are, let me just set the record straight on one comment you made earlier. Technically, crime rates are actually down around the country. Violent crime is up slightly, and gun over the last year is up slightly. But over the last 8 or 9 years, crime in general has been going down. So let's acknowledge that this is not the crisis that some would say we are. But where we are now, the line of demarcation for modern policing was the murder of George Floyd. At that point, moving forward, the face of policing is never going to be what it used to be. And now we have to take a really hard look at how we do policing, because traditionally, policing hasn't changed the way it trains officers in about 110 years. I mean, other than technology and stuff, it's the reactive nature of policing, and upwards of 90% of policing is reactive. And I spend about 300 hours a year training and educating police officers around the country. The problem is we spend too much time on the technical aspect of training and not enough time educating the police. We need to introduce communication skills and critical thinking skills to get police to move beyond the emotion of the job and to have police officers become problem solvers. So that's the starting point, the re-education of policing.
All right, the re-education of policing. Senator Sidnor, your opinion on the moment we're in.
I think here in the state of Maryland, we're at the beginning of some pretty good reforms. When I came in office in 2015, advocates were pushing. I mean, I think my first day when I was walking to our committee meeting, advocates were pushing for reform. And there was a little reform that was done. At the end of that session, the state experienced a situation surrounding what occurred with Freddie Gray. So then the following session, there was a little bit more reform. But as one of our other panelists had noted, after what had transpired with George Floyd, with a change in leadership in both houses in the General Assembly, with one of the largest Black, or I should say the largest Black caucuses in the United States, reform was going to happen last year, in last session, and it did happen. So we've had some laws that have now been gone into effect. We have a few other laws that are part of that Maryland Police Accountabilities Act that will be going into effect in 2022. But I would say that I believe that the public probably feels now that after all these years that they've been heard. Obviously, the legislation that we put forth isn't perfect, but it's moving us in the right direction.
Okay, so you said the legislation you put forth isn't perfect, but it's moving in the right direction. We look forward to delving into that further. Thank you so much. Dr. Boyd, thank you so much for bringing us your expertise. We wanted to go back in history to bring us to the very beginning of the U.S. experiment in policing. And is it true that policing was just all about property? And can you give us a sense of how policing got started in the country?
When you take a typical policing class or intro to policing class, everyone points to Sir Robert Peel in Great Britain, who introduced legislation in 1828. It became law in 1829. It established the London Metropolitan Police. This is the first time we saw a uniformed civilian paid police department organized along military lines. Because of that, we call him the father of modern policing. But the truth is, the inconvenient truth is that policing actually was happening in this country well over 100 years prior to that. In South Carolina in 1703 is the first time we see documents that point to slave patrols, and it references slave patrols a decade previous to that. So what are slave patrols? They were white men on horses with long guns riding around the South looking for Black people that were not on plantations. So it's kind of a misnomer when they just called them slave patrols, because there were free Black people in the South at the time that were either born free or won their freedom or earned their freedom. And if they found Black people outside of a plantation, they typically would snatch them up, rip up their papers, whip them, and then resell them into slavery. Much in the same way we saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, which is based on a true story. That's ultimately what they did. And that's how the formation of policing in the South and border states happened. And a lot of people say, well, there's no connection to slave patrol and what we're doing today. Well, if you look at the badge that the slave patrollers wore, it was the same 5-point star that virtually every sheriff's department wears, and many police departments still wear that badge today, including the marshals. So there are symbols of slave patrols that are still prevalent. And slave patrols gave way to slave codes, which led to Black codes, which led to segregation, which led to Jim Crow, which led to the civil rights struggle, which led to the war on crime, and then stop and frisk, then the war on drugs, then zero tolerance, and then racial profiling. So at every point in our nation's history, every 20 years or so, we see the next iteration of what happened that started with slave patrols. So to say that there's no connection just says that you're being disingenuous or you don't want to actually learn what the truth is. Because as soon as we acknowledge this is how policing started, now what are we going to do about it?
So let's just break this down just a little bit. So back then, Black people who were enslaved were considered the property of white slave owners.
Mhm.
And so the slave patrols were police people who were hired by whom?
They were mostly hired by private citizens or plantation owners.
To basically go and get their property.
Well, no, part of it was to go and get slaves that were escaped, or to cut down on slave insurrection. But also, if you find a Black person that wasn't part of a plantation, to enslave them and sell them at a much lower cost. So slave patrols were grabbing up Black people, selling them at a lower cost and keeping the profit. So it absolutely was a profit-driven organization when it started.
So basically to protect the property, quote unquote, of the white slave owners, but also to basically falsely imprison freed slave people. Would you also say that they were there to actually reinforce and keep the racial hierarchy in place?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, they were. They used whatever they could. They used religion, and they talked about what was going on in the slavery in the Old Testament to justify it. And they were the strong arm, because a lot of people said that slavery was this economic thing in the South. Because remember, once we stopped slavery, once Juneteenth happened in 1867, the plantation owners said, now we can't produce crops or anything. So they went from slave codes directly into Black codes, and these same slave patrol members moved into a lot of Southern police departments, same people.
So how do we get, I'm going to come back to that point. How do we get then taxpayers taking on the responsibility for basically covering the salaries of these patrol/police departments? And then of course, what was the role of political people in terms of influencing how these police departments ran and how police officers were selected?
Well, because they were paid for by private citizens, they were at the beck and call of private citizens, and many times they wouldn't enforce anything else. So at some point, they decided we're going to have a marshal in our town, or we're going to have a sheriff, and then they deputize them through a process called posse comitatus, and they then bring them in and start paying them from the little bit of taxes that were paid. But again, most of the people paying taxes were land-owning white men paying taxes to make sure their lot in life was held.
And you said, interestingly, earlier that they only enforce things selectively.
Absolutely.
Meaning that they enforced only what the property owners or those who are paying the bills wanted to be enforced.
Or they enforce what they chose to enforce. And if you look at policing in 2021, it's still discretion oriented. So the police get to decide when they stop you, whether or not you get a ticket or whether or not you get a warning. So the same level of discretion that's born into policing was evident 200 and 300 years ago in this country.
Captain Lilly, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think in order to lend some volume to the conversation as it relates to understanding that we would be remiss to also suggest that there weren't African Americans who participated in the slave patrol, because they did. And in many instances, and what we have to understand from that context, that we find people then and now who often become very loyal to opportunities and not people. And so as we move forward, so I don't jump too far ahead of the conversation, we need to make sure that we balance the conversation out and understanding that there was not just people that didn't look like us who participated in that. There was actually people who participated who looked exactly like us in the slave patrols, as much as we did when we think about slavery in general.
So Dr. Boyd actually said a lot in his responses with regards to the whole issue of selective policing. Would you agree that that history of white landowners basically exempting themselves from policing, even as they paid for the policing of the rest of the community, still actually having influence today in terms of how we choose or not to choose to police our communities?
Is that for me?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so I agree. I think that it's good for us to be educated to move ourselves forward, to know the history, right? I think that it becomes very difficult for you to start trying to build a foundation and plan and how you should move forward if you don't really fully have the full context of the history. However, as someone who's taught diversity, as someone who also started my college life at a HBCU where it became mandatory at North Carolina Central, my same shameless plug, to be educated about African American history. And that was my first time having a full context about history. And so what we find is that no matter what profession it is, there's always this cyclical process that goes into place of us being able to have enough information so that we have a solid foundation to make decisions. And as much as I agree with us being able to do that, what I also suggest in many instances is that we start having these conversations internally, which we started doing here a little bit, just like we started talking about earlier about the whole George Floyd thing. We got a new chief a couple of years ago, and she believed that at that time we was right in the middle of COVID as well when the George Floyd incident happened, and we had a conversation with just the executives about what happened, because we knew we needed to have that conversation. And myself personally, I had to pull over on the side of the road for about 15 minutes before I came home, because I also knew it was a conversation that I needed to have at home. And so what I always do is remind people who are not in the profession, and Dr. Cummings, you remember me from, because when your husband was still around, we played a lot around, and not played around so much, but we had extensive conversations just about things like this. And I was Sergeant Lilly at that time in my career. And we had some real extensive conversations. This was right on the heels of Barack Obama's 21st Century Policing. And we just talked about, and Dr. Boyd nailed it. We touched on it, but he nailed it. There's a difference between training and education. We do a lot of training. And so, but when it comes to the educational component, and then particularly as it relates to us dealing with people, whether it be the history that now manifests into policy of how we execute our job, how do you measure that? And so we have to understand it in this full context that all of us came from the background of our own socio-eccentric environment that helped shape the way that we think, the values. One of the things I remind people, Orlando Lilly's from North Carolina. I'm a true country boy, Southern Baptist boy, where we only had an organ in the church. And so when I moved to Baltimore and we saw an organ and people playing a guitar in a Baptist church, that was like blasphemy. However, I tell you that to suggest even in that diversity amongst ourselves, it's very different about our experiences, how we see and deal with race on a land scale, particularly when I meet brothers and sisters who are from Maryland, who for many of them, they may not have encountered anything like that until they got older and became adults. Where Orlando Lilly can remember when Roots, I'm dating myself, when Roots came on and we had to shut schools down South because it put schools in such an uproar. So I think that the educational component can't just be centered around policing when we talk about this, because policing is an organization that is filled with people who actually have the power to influence in a negative or positive way for people's the rest of their lives. And I'm one of those people.
So I'm trying to get a sense of this. Are you arguing for standards in terms of greater standards in terms of how police are recruited and educated across the country, that there needs to be standards for what they learn about various communities and how they actually go about implementing that learning in their through the course of their jobs?
My and I wouldn't say argue for standards, because I think that becomes the go-to for all of us, right? Policy and standards become our easy go-to because we can check off and say, hey, well, I went down and I did this. What I'm saying is we have to start finding a way to measure it. Law enforcement is an adaptive culture, and culture in general is adaptive. And what we all would make a natural proclivity to do is we will make some level of adaptation to survive in that environment, even those of us within this culture. So as someone that was once in charge of some employment background investigations and recruitment, the number one question that I always ask people, and people answer it in different ways, and Dr. Boyd gonna pick up on this right away, is when you ask people, why did you want to become the police? Right? And everybody says, I want to help people, until they got to help people. Because the way I look at helping someone may look very different of how it helps someone. When I taught my diversity class, one of the assignments that I gave the students was they had to pick one topic off all the major networks and then watch how differently the networks dealt with the topic. And so I could let them see in that moment, and not bash in the media, but so people can always remember that because the news always provides information, doesn't always mean that information is news. And so once we realize that there's something that goes on in our psyche about what our circles look like, even amongst us, and I won't put people on the spot, but I always ask people, well, what does your circle look like? So the standard has to be measuring how are people faring along at some point in time. And it can't just be internal, right? Because we see that, okay, and I'm telling you this from even going to community meetings. These are things that I tell community members. Baltimore Woodlawn Precinct out of Baltimore County is one of the most dense populations in Baltimore County. In 2010, and I'm waiting on the 2020 numbers, 2010, it had a population of over 100,011 people. If my precinct is fully manned, I have 157 officers. The busiest shift, which is now has 16 officers. Back out 5 of those officers because they're supervisors, back out another 3 who weren't the desk area. Now have 8 off. And that's for the people who participated in the census. It doesn't count the churches. It doesn't count the schools. It doesn't count faith-based institutions when they're populated. And so we're asking young men and women to be able to like manage which this wellness piece, and Dr. Debnam, I'll probably speak more about this later, how now we're learning how significant this wellness piece is even for us, because the occupational focus is on me finding bad things. So then now psychologically, the neurological pathways that are starting to develop in my mind, everything is bad. And so when I run up on Dr. Cummings, I'm thinking, oh, well, she just probably gonna be bad too. Because now the neurologically, we're starting to develop that. And that is something that when I talk about the evolution of policing, things that generally we wouldn't have thought about years ago. We're starting to think about them now because we're understanding that there are some cognitive things that go along with this work that can change how we deal with people. And when I was in the police academy, one of my instructors used to tell me, all the friends I had that weren't police, I need to still have those friends. 27 years now, I understand why he said that. Because if I'm circling around all the people who think like me all day, and I'll be the first one to tell all of you, Orlando Lilly would get home from work and watch the ID channel all day because I'm still like just interested in crime. And so, but if I do not pull myself back and allow myself to engage in conversations with people who may not look at it from the perspective that I have, and then kind of add some rational thought to what I'm doing, which then turns into me controlling my own beliefs and my values and my inferences as it relates to the work, then that becomes a problem. Now, I'm a little bit educated, I like to believe, so I can make that level of self-awareness apply to myself. But that's hard for people if you're doing this day in and day out and you're dealing with burst stress. And now I got to go home and kind of unwind and let myself go on. And when I talk about burst stress, the guy or girl who has to handle a call from a noise complaint that automatically turns into an active shooter event.
Dr.
And
Debnam,
so,
go ahead.
And so I'll just close it off by saying that I don't think it's so much that we focus on the standards. I think we have to start focusing on how we measure what we have already. Because to continue to add stuff to it, all you're doing is keep adding stuff, but then what is going to be the measurement of it? And it can't keep being the measure on the back end of a crisis.
So what I hear him saying, Dr. Debnam, and you correct me if I'm wrong, and I would like for you to expound on this, and you are on mute, so just take yourself off of mute, is that, you know, we need ways to measure the educational level of the police officers, but also implicit and explicit bias. That, you know, that we need to find ways to measure how people are perceiving of the people they're supposed to serve in communities. And then how that then in turn influences how they interact or fail to accurately interact with community members. Have you seen evidence of that kind of measurement working? And what do you think is needed?
I think, you know, we are just, you know, starting to do that kind of measuring of persons, you know, awareness of what their mindset is. And so we haven't been taught to think like that. We've been taught to just see results and not see how did we get to those results? You know, what is our background? What about what's going on in our home life? What's going on in our minds? Are we getting enough rest? Are we eating well? Are we doing the things that we need to do to be able to bring ourselves to work in a good frame of mind, so that when we do interact with persons that are different or difficult in our minds, they're difficult, or people we perceive as a threat, we're prepared to handle it. But some of this has to be new training. This is new information for us. We talk a lot at work about emotional intelligence because it's your EQ, as we know, is more important than your IQ. And so in that regard, you might have people that are entering the profession of police work that are great, you know, great IQs, intelligent, have all of the bells checked, I mean, they can pass the polygraph. Their PT is at the top. Their numbers. They can even master some of the interpersonal skills, right? That we would say, hey, this is great. They say they want to help people. That's one of their answers. Hey, I want to work with people, help people. But the learning curve is in them being able to understand the people that they're called to serve. And that requires empathy, that requires social awareness. And so if your context is closed off or everybody around you has the same mindset and you're not open to learning about different cultures or different people, or even different people in your own culture. We have subgroups, right, within every culture. And if I think my mindset is the only way to go, then when I encounter these others, my bias the implicit bias that I might have against people of my own racial background will rise up, let alone people that are different or other. And so I think that's going to take some training from the top down. We like to do this DEI training from the bottom up. We need top down training, because what's happened, and I interact with law enforcement on different levels, is that what they'll say is, hey, well, this is all good for me, but the captain's going to do this, but the sergeant's going to do this, but they're going to be different from whatever I'm learning. Yeah, it's okay for me to take this training, but they're going to say, well, this is how we do it here. That was class. The class is for you to check the box. But if you're trying to implement it when you go back into the workplace, sometimes that's not accepted. And so we have to work all angles. That I think the implicit bias and the overt bias is there. We all have it. It's time to kind of admit it and unlearn and be able to, if we're called to serve people, as most of them say, that's why they're in the field, then let's serve people and learn more about how to serve people.
So let me just push you a little bit. Dr. Boyd basically started by saying that policing started as a racist construct and it's still a racist construct.
Yeah.
So the question for me to you is do you think that it's possible for police officers to unlearn racism, whether they're white or black? Because internalized racism and bias exists as well. I just read a study that said that the more young black men that are in the community, the higher the perception of crime, even though that might not be the reality, because the bias is in the stereotype of black men.
Yeah, I think you can unlearn things. There was saying that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, recently in neurological studies, right, you can create new neural pathways, right? You can unlearn some things. Now, it might take a while, it's not going to be easy, and you have to have the desire to want to learn something new. So part of it is, I have a desire to learn something new. I have the empathy to put myself in the shoes of those persons that I serve. And I am availing myself to training, not to check a box, but to actually grow, to actually be a better servant to the public, so it becomes a mindset thing. And mindsets can change and shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. But it all starts with, do you want to change? And so that's where the trouble is. People will say they want to change, but in all actuality, they benefit from things remaining the same.
Right. Senator Sydnor, you said you're a proud resident of Baltimore County, and the Maryland State Legislature actually created the Baltimore County Police Department in 1874, which is like incredible when you think about it. history is that the black officer, a first black officer, wasn't appointed until like 78 years later in 1952. Today, Baltimore County police officers, 80% are white, while whites only make up 57% of the county's overall population, according to the US Census. Same thing in terms of the disparities in Baltimore City. So, what, as a senator representing this area with a footprint in both Baltimore County and Baltimore City, what do you think of those statistics?
Well, and given the panel that we have here tonight with Captain Lilly and his work in the Blue Guardians, I don't know if I'm probably the best one to answer this question.
Oh, I'm going to get to Captain Lilly.
But Baltimore County, their police department has work to do. And the Blue Guardians certainly held a mirror up to the county when our county was sued because of its hiring practices. Certainly, I think the community has called for a more diverse police department. They want a community of officers and government that reflect the diversity of the community. Now, does that mean that because you have a more diverse workforce that everything is always going to play out like you want? No, but what I do think it does do is it brings people into our communities. I mean, I've known Captain Lilly for a number of years, and when we found out that he was coming to be a captain of a precinct that covers the majority of the district that I represent out here in Baltimore County, I was ecstatic. One of the first things that he did is he got out into the community and did a number of community walks so that he was building relationships. And ultimately, I think that's what all of this is about building relationships. Prior to Captain Lilly coming in, we had Captain Fisher, who had good relationships. I mean, good person, good relationships. So, I mean, ultimately, a lot of it comes down to that. And really, if you had the choice between an officer that looked like me, but was someone who was inhospitable, didn't know how to talk or treat me, versus someone who didn't look like me, but respected me and my community, I'd go with that second officer all the time. And really, I think that's what the community has been calling for, officers really just to treat our community with some respect and dignity. And really that's been what the floor has been to this entire call for police reform. I mean, when you have officers who, you have different incidents that you see in the press, and you, by the way, let's talk about Eric Garner, someone who's choked to death for selling loose cigarettes. I mean, that's something that within our community, you're going to say, now, that would not have happened to someone that wasn't Black. Just a few days ago. I mean, now that the incident that's getting people up in arms is an incident that had happened, I believe, in Ohio, where you had a paraplegic man who was pulled out of his car after calling or asking the officers, I guess, for the commander. So you have this debate that's going. How would someone else that wasn't Black have been treated? So it's those questions that are always in the backs of I think the Black community's minds about, are they treating me like this because of the color of my skin?
Sure.
I'm sorry?
I said, absolutely, that's the question.
Right,
But
right.
let me push you a little bit further. We've had a change in leadership in Baltimore City in terms of the police commissioner. We've had a change in leadership in Baltimore County. Dr. Boyd, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically political leaders have always been involved in the appointment of high-level police officers in places around the country. So today, what role do politicians play in the appointment of police chiefs and police captains and other police leaders? Senator Sydnor.
That's a real good question, because I will tell you, in Baltimore County, when we had an opportunity to bring on a new police chief that had risen through the ranks in this police department, this county went another way. And I know I supported this particular candidate. He didn't get the job, but someone else saw value in him and made him a chief of police in another state. So yes, I mean, ultimately it depends on the governance of that particular government. So here it's the county executive's choice. In Baltimore City, it's the mayor's choice. But the community, if they're unsatisfied, they have to make certain that they let us elected officials know that they're unsatisfied. Here in Baltimore County, I had an opportunity just a few years ago. We were looking and having some conversations. I began looking at traffic stops out here in the county and did a little data request. And when that information came out, I guess one shouldn't have been shocked, but I guess I was shocked at how bad it was. And we worked along with the county executive, put a task force together, and have been attempting to resolve the disparities that we see in traffic stops of Black motorists out here in Baltimore County. We take citizens who reach out. We try to take some of the complaints and things that you see, and your tool as a legislator is to try to take that incident, look at the law, and see where you can make adjustments to the law to make things more fair and more equitable. By way of example, and this again relates to traffic stops. We've had incidents where people have been stopped because their license plate frame gave the pretext for a stop because the license plate frame may have been put on inaccurately. It may have covered a little bit of something that it shouldn't have covered, or you may have had a license plate cover that actually my wife, she was stopped for something like that. You had the vinyl cover that was clear, but the officer used that as the pretext to stop her. This is something that happens all the time. So you try to take things with the law and change them. So with the license plate frames, 2 years ago, we passed a law to make that a secondary offense. I mean, really, do you want your law enforcement officers using their time to make those kinds of stops as primary offenses? So you use those kinds of tools to modify and really try to limit those kinds of interactions that law enforcement officers are having with the citizens.
Dr. Boyd and Captain Lilly, can you speak to the racial disparities in terms of where we see these majority, minority, quote unquote, areas being predominantly policed by white officers, and also the selection of top officers in these communities?
I've got about 17 things I was writing down as people were talking. And for the record, when Orlando was talking, I took the most notes. Whenever you're teaching a class, bro, I want to come and sit in on your class, man. But so let's start from the same position. There is an implication that policing in this country is racist. I'd like to pull back from that a little bit. Okay. America is racist. In America, police get their people from America. So we shouldn't think that there's going to be a disparity. But I don't believe that most individual officers are racist. I don't think that's the case at all. Most officers are law-abiding, God-fearing citizens that really want to do the right thing. The problem comes, we put them in situations, we train them in such a way that how they see the job is going to be very different. For instance, if you get really good Black officers and put them in a Black community in West Baltimore and you tell them, this area is really dangerous, these people are really bad, this is where the crime is, by definition, they're going to ramp it up a little bit. That has nothing to do with the individual officer. It has everything to do with the training. We need to reimagine training and introduce education. But when you think about who we hire as police officers, so let's think about it. So I went through the academy after I had a bachelor's degree. But in order to get a job in policing, you have to be 21 years old and have a GED, period. Now, let's acknowledge that the average adult brain doesn't even finish fully developing until 25 or 26, but we're giving 21-year-olds discretion and the ability to use deadly force, and we're wondering why that goes south so much. So when you look at police training here in Connecticut, where I live, the state mandate is 905 hours for police training. To be a beautician, to do my daughter's hair, you had to have 1,500 to 2,000 hours, but the police are 900 hours. So we should reimagine how we do that. And as far as moving Black officers in, I'm definitely a proponent of increasing the amount of diversity in every department. I published an article in 2010 called Light Blue versus Dark Blue that looked at attitude differences between Black and white police officers. There's my shameless plug. Feel free to Google it. And Black officers that are from the community tend to be more service oriented than the people that come from somewhere else. And let's acknowledge, and let's go all the way back to the captain's statement a minute ago when we talked about standards. I would like to have national standards because I can tell you they police in Anne Arundel very differently than they police in Baltimore. And then where I lived on the Eastern Shore in Wycomico County, they also police very differently than they do in PG County. If we had standards that hold people accountable, and that's what we're looking for, levels of accountability. And when we talk about accountability, people get their feelings hurt. Everyone spends a lot of time talking about white fragility and issues of race. Let's change that. It's blue fragility that we need to look at, because as soon as we start talking about levels of accountability in policing, then the police decide that they are the victim here and they don't want to have these discussions. So when we talk about police reform, we need to bring the police to the table as well. And instead of legislators doing things absent of the police, we need police leaders in there. And the one thing I'm glad the senator said, we give the police tools to harm our community. The license plate thing, the light over your plate, the frame. If we give the police a pretext for a stop, they're going to use it as a pretext for the stop. So we have to make those level 2 offenses and not a primary reason to stop it. So I actually, with all due respect, I point an accusatory finger at the lawmakers, because those laws are the things that are harming our community. And I don't think it's just about race. I think it's primarily an economic thing, because middle class and affluent Blacks don't have the same negative interaction as our working class brothers and sisters. So we need to also address that as well, because if we ignore class issues, we ignore a lot of the problem. And then a lot of the people that we need to help, we're not allowed to help them.
I'm just curious because Senator Sydnor just talked about his wife being pulled over on the pretext of having and they're middle class. So what do you mean by middle class brothers and sisters don't have the same challenges that working class do?
So that's the N of 1. If we were to go through all of the data for Baltimore County, and if we overlay census tract data on the people that are stopped, the vast majority of the people that are stopped are not going to be middle class folks. I'm not saying that it won't happen, but I'm saying the preponderance of the people that are going to be stopped are going to be people that are at or below the poverty line.
And so I'm going to jump in right there, because that's a great point that he made, and put on my statistics hat and pretty much say that when we're looking at variables, you can't just allow yourself to isolate a variable, because now you kind of make that be a wash. And everybody on here that know anything about real research know that we need to find, when you're doing research, you need to be able to come up and find the same thing and the same pattern over and over again, considering the variables that you're using to deal with that. And so my thing is this: and I say we as even a community, we engage in these conversations on the back of crisis, right? What I asked somebody to tell me the other day, and I won't mention the media channel, but there are some media journalists that I really loved. I really loved them, and I put the ED for a reason, because since George Floyd and we've moved on, their conversations have moved on, right? And so I'm like, man, they was really on this when it was a topic, and even with us. And so when we talk about what police departments look like, the senator's right. Yeah, we do have work to do, but I consider we are a team, the community and the law enforcement. I'm not going to do this to you, and I'm going to move Dr. Boyd out of this conversation. But if I was to ask any of you, how many people that you've seen that look like us that you've recruited to become police officers, what would your response be? Right? We, just like we choose people that we want to have in our lives, when it comes to this work, we also have to make sure that we're choosing people that we want to police us. We can't solely leave that in somebody else's hand. And so places that have those abilities to put on forums where you can bring people in like me or other people to have those conversations, then we'll do that, because there's a difference between diversity consciousness and diversity presence. We focus often on diversity presence, meaning that we want a bunch of people that look like us, but they might not really. And I'm gonna take off my captain hat for a minute and it just be Orlando. Well, all your skin folk, not your kinfolk. So sometimes you may still be choosing someone who's not good for us. And the senator said it great. Well, sometimes, and my own personal story is Orlando Lilly came into this work because I moved from North Carolina to Jersey City, ended up in a situation that I put myself in, where a young brother, Puerto Rican brother, had cut me from the back of my arm to the front of my arm. And I had 32 stitches in, 32 out. They had to cauterize the nerves in my gut, and I almost died on a bed. And there was a police officer around the corner who was shedding tears trying to figure out what in the world that was going on that was going to put a 10-year-old boy in this situation that he almost lost his life. He didn't look like me, and he was in a profession that I was starting to be conditioned not to like. And at that time, I said that if I lived, I was going to do what he did. He kept his hand on my family. When we moved back to North Carolina, he said, put me in a Boys and Girls Club. That changed the whole trajectory of my life, because that was the first time that I saw compassion from a man in a long time, and he didn't look like me. So I'm with Dr. Boyd. Like, yes, we do have to make sure that we're having these conversations about the role that race plays, but we can't act like it is the front and center of what we need to do to move forward, because it has always been here. And these are full of educated people. Race is really a construct of man. That's still a fairly new phenomenon. Like, that wasn't something that we've always had. And ironically, it came from a place of faith. So we have to be very cognizant about how we're dealing with, because, like I said, diversity consciousness is different from diversity presence. And then we have to understanding diversity and diversity awareness, and then the actual skills that come along with diversity. All those things become very applicable as we deal with these kind of topics. And even though we're talking about this tonight, the time doesn't provide us to get all the way into like, how do we come to ultimate solutions? Because
because we do have to move on.
Okay. Yeah.
But thank you. I deeply appreciate it. Dr. Dubnam and Senator Sydnor, where were you? What was your original reaction when you heard defund the police?
Well, I'll start. My original reaction was, I thought, well, defund the police meant, we would take, maybe lessen their budget, decrease their, reach into different areas so that they would focus on just, serving the community. Just a little bit of information, learning about what that means. It means, for the activists, hey, we're going to take some of the funds that are allocated for policing and put them into community programs, whether it is like the Boys and Girls Clubs or some other, I would say, programs that will help reduce crime and maybe address some of the ills or disparities. I'm going to say disparities that are in the community that are underfunded. So if people feel like the police are overfunded, then defunding them, in my concept, isn't totally taking their money and moving it to some other place, even though I know that's what some of the activists want to do. But that's my take on it. You know,
In fact, they were actually, some of them were arguing to take some of the money and fund programs like yours.
yes, which would be great. No, and the reason I say that, think about that program we had in the pre-release center, where I called that program, I called it the men's empowerment sessions. And basically though, I went over, you know, anger, depression. And before you get out here, I would always tell the guys, I said, look, I don't know how long you've been in here, but the way it is when you come out now, it's totally different. You need a whole nother mindset. The things that, the way you thought coming in here or whatever got you to be incarcerated, you're going to have a whole new thought process when you get back out. And so, you know, just even before they got incarcerated, if we had programs to kind of, you know, expand the reach of mental health in the community that would prevent, or even, you know, even if not prevent, but have some, you know, we have mental health courts now, like we have drug courts. We have persons going out on patrols with officers that are mental health trained that can help, you know, de-escalate crisis. So this is where I would like to see more of the funding go towards mental health, especially as a lot of people that are in these unfortunate incidents, we know and we hear have had a prior mental health challenge and may have been called by family members. The police have been called to help de-escalate a situation that only escalated and ended in their loved one's death. So that's mine.
Nora, you know, Maryland has become, I think, first in the nation on police reform. Can you tell us more about the Maryland Police Accountability Act of 2021? But before you do, we have a question from the audience, and that is, can you tell us and explain qualified immunity? So, you know, actually, this is going to be a three-part question. What is police reform to you? What is qualified immunity? And tell us about the Maryland Police Accountability Act of 2021.
All right, and if I remember, if I forget any of the three, you just help me out. All right, so what is police reformation to me? A lot of it looks like what we've been doing this last session and over the course of a number of years. I remember in, I think it was 2015, I had worked with Senator Nathan Pulliam and on a bill where we wanted to get additional information and put a pilot program together on with Baltimore City's police department and Baltimore County's police department to ensure that both of these departments had crisis intervention teams. So reformation to me looks a lot different. Going back to your defund question, and again, what that meant was a reallocation. Again, when we're calling police officers in, I think it's a question of what do you really want law enforcement to be doing? Do you want them dealing with people that are homeless? Do you want them dealing with people who are having mental health crises? Are they the best that we have to be dealing with those situations, or would you prefer them to be dealing with violent crimes and things like that? To Dr. Boyd's point, I think there's some truth in what he was saying. Legislators, we listen to the general public, and at times we criminalize things that probably don't need to be criminalized. And by then criminalizing these things, then there's someone that has to do the enforcement of that law once passed. So who do we use to enforce the laws? We use police officers. So really, I think some reformation is really looking at the things that we want to criminalize and really thinking hard about where, I guess, the efforts, the money that we want to put into or behind what this is. I mean, our criminal justice system. I mean, I think And I know back in the 90s, the former mayor, Kurt Schmoke, was really raked over the coals for some of his thoughts when it came to drug reform. But really, reform, I mean, do we want law enforcement officers putting themselves in harm's way to make purchases of drugs and things like that because someone is having mental health crises and they have a drug habit? And I mean, this is such a large problem. And that can be addressed from so many different ways.
How did the Maryland Police Accountability Act of 2021 do that?
You know what? It did a number of things. And the Maryland Police Accountability Act was about 5 different bills. One of the bills sends or will send control of the Baltimore City Police Department back to the police if the citizens of Baltimore want it. The Police Accountability Act, it changes the use of force standard. The Police Accountability Act, it says that no to demilitarization of police departments. What it does is it creates an early intervention program that's non-punitive for officers that are having I think it's 3 complaints that are filed against them. So it's trying to be proactive and give officers mental health programs that they need. It's a package of bills that includes some loan forgiveness, some scholarship money, trying to help educate or have a more educated police force. It's the reformation or the actual setting aside of the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights and the creation of an entirely new disciplinary system. It's a bill that is going to bring forth a variety of data that we've never had so that we can begin looking at really some of the things that are going on when it comes to warrants and things like that. It's a bill that is going to reform traffic stops for our everyday citizens. So now,
qualified immunity?
Oh, qualified immunity is essentially a concept that so let's say you're hurt by an officer, and that officer you want to sue the officer, get at the officer. If they're acting under the color of law, acting within their scope of work, they're immune from being sued. Essentially, that's what it is. So I mean, in a nutshell.
But did the Maryland?
No, it had nothing. It did not touch on qualified immunity. In fact, I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine who I believe is intended on introducing a bill next session on qualified immunity.
But it did get rid of the Maryland Law Officers Bill of Rights.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and so just briefly explain what it got rid of.
The entire system of how these trial boards and the disciplinary system that was in place has been redone, and I can't necessarily put that in a few words because it sets up trial boards and the whole other system. What I can say about that is that law will not go into effect until 2022.
Okay.
So still plenty of some work to do on it.
This is a question that I do want to direct towards Dr. Boyd and Captain Lilly. You both talked about accountability, and yet in so many instances where things that have been done by police seem to be egregious to the community, we see the police union time and time again taking a stance to support the seemingly indefensible. And so, my question for you is, what is the role of the police unions in lessening the accountability that you call for?
Let me start by, let me take one step back to the defund movement. When we talk about defunding police, it's the same thing that every mayor and every police chief does every spring. It's just resource reallocation. We added a term to be hurtful because hurt people hurt people. So when we talk about a defund movement and you talk to people, if you ask them, do you want zero funding for the police? Tell me what that looks like. Most people back off of that and they talk about reallocating resources. So I did some work with the mayor of Los Angeles when they pulled $150 million out of LAPD's budget and put that into preventative programs, and police officers lost their mind. Well, the LAPD budget is $2 billion. So the amount of money that they pulled out was like pocket change. New York City, $10.5 billion. So when you look at a police budget, 80% of a police budget is personnel. It's salary and benefits. And then about 10% of that is overtime. And the rest is equipment. So the point that some people are making is take some of the overtime money and reallocate it into preventative programs that actually cause the overtime, and that should counterbalance things out. But I own a consulting company that works with police departments. And the one thing I can tell you, as soon as you cut a police budget, the very first thing that goes is the training budget. So the amount of money to bring in my company to try to do cultural competence, now they're telling me they don't have the money because the budget is a cut. And then if you look, most of the departments that lost funding when violent crime went up this year, they got all that money back and then some. So to me, that was that was something that's still a work in progress. But as far as police unions, in full disclosure, I was the president of our union once upon a time, 100 years ago. And the role of a union is to protect the officer. If you stop there, that's the problem. The role should be to protect the good officer and to ferret out the bad officers. Because I can tell you, most officers, when a bad officer does something bad, wish that they hadn't done that. So a lot of officers wish that they could do something. And it's really funny now that there's a lot of states that are doing jurisdiction that are doing laws that say the police now have a duty to intervene, and they're making it a criminal offense, which to me is ironic because the job of the police is to intervene when people do stuff wrong. So the fact that we have to legislate it. So the very first question, where are we now? Where are we going? Now we're at a point where progressive police leaders and community members and legislators, I think, are on the right page and on the same page for the first time in a really long time. So it's a slow process. We didn't get here overnight. This is 400 years of stuff that got us to this point. So to go slowly, so you're not going to have a legislation decide all of a sudden qualified immunity is gone, police bill of rights gone, and everything gone. That's not going to happen that way. We have to go incremental steps. We have to go from none to some, and then from some to more.
Okay. We are now in a situation where we've got, I think, 12 minutes left in our conversation. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you for succinct answers to some of the questions that audience members have asked. And I'm also going to weave in some of the last questions that I actually also had of you. And Dr. Boyd, this is back at you. Is there a way to adjust the discretion-oriented concept in the education of police? Or in reality, is there always going to be some subjectivity to enforcement? So how does education and training take discretion-oriented issues into account?
We don't want to end discretion. If we end discretion, we get zero tolerance policing again. Everybody gets hammered for everything that they do. And we saw when it happened in New York, it shut down the court system. We want police officers that have critical thinking skills, that are problem solvers. We want to allow the police to have discretion, but we want them to make better choices.
Does that mean you get rid of the GED standard and go to a bachelor's degree?
Well, the problem with that, and I've worked with a lot of states that tried to do that, that then cuts out the number of officers or applicants of color that are now going to apply. So we lose that. And then because if you're a person of color and you've got a bachelor's degree, I got to tell you, there's a whole lot more you can do than just policing. So that'll cut down the people that go into policing.
Okay, Captain or Lily, maybe you know the answer to this one. Do the police do a 6-month background check before they hire new police? This is from Joyce.
Yeah, so background checks and background times is really based on an individual's life experience. So you don't have a long life experience, your background investigation is shorter. You have one that you've done things over a period of time, it may take a little bit longer. And what I call it is like the perfect web. We find that, you apply to 7 different jobs, but you told us one. And then now that turns into something else. And then you tell us something doing a polygraph or something, doing the background reveals that you actually did something criminal. That turns into something else. So background investigations for the work are not straightforward. What I would suggest to everybody, because we've limited time right now too, is that everybody who's not attended a Citizens Academy, you need to attend one. It allows you to be on the inside of the police department. And I always we tell students there's no such thing as a bad question, but I always do tell them that there's a such thing as a better question. And normally better questions come on the back of if you're better educated about how the system works.
Okay. So actually, I have a follow-up for you. It says Captain Lilly referenced 2010 census numbers for Woodlawn, 15 officers to 100,000 citizens. Does the overwhelming numerical disparity lend to perceived fear by police officers in communities of color? What should your Woodlawn workforce numbers be for 2021?
So when the new chief came in, we've not done a staffing study in a long time. Normally, those are things that when you have people at the top, you're expecting them to be able to have the acumen of an organization, at least as it relates to organizations like this, to be able to have the insight of what needs to be looked at. And so we haven't had that in a couple of years. The new chief has currently brought some people in to do staffing studies. What they'll do is they'll do an analysis based on our calls of service. And what I tell people, when I give people the number, you can't just look at just the bottom number, right? You have, it's almost like somebody saying, oh, I got $1 million. Well, they forget about taxes. And so the numbers also equate into the fact that what people have to remember, law enforcement was not designed to make communities better communities by themselves. They were just a tool in the toolbox to aid in that effort. And so one of the things I point out to people is that one of the nights that we have where there's been, and it's not always consistent, but one of the nights I looked at when we had a national night out, and I was like, okay, that was interesting that we didn't have a lot of stuff going on a national night out. So what was the immediate obvious thing that we had? A bunch of people out in their communities. And so when I do the community walks, it's not just about the relationship. It is about getting community members to understand, okay, I'm going to do this with you, but you have to continue to do this as well in your own community. And so what happens is oftentimes we've turned into a very technical driven society. All of us are on these all the time, all of us, not just kids. And so very few of us talk to our neighbors. And so we'll get calls on somebody calling the police on their neighbor who both lived in that community for over 20 something years, but you haven't talked to your neighbor. So there are some other components that go along with that when we look at numbers.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Debnam, this one is for you. Are there solutions for youth who come from bad environments? What can be done to mentor them and point them in the right direction? Glennetta.
The solutions, I think, for youth are, again, is multifaceted, and having those programs that can bridge the gap between, the environments those youth are in, and also, getting parents involved is really tough. A lot of parents have hectic work schedules, maybe working 2 or 3 jobs. And so they're not there to be that model or intervene on some of their children's behalf. And a lot of our children, or the ones I know of, some of them have lost parents at a young age. And so they're being reared by their grandparents or aunts and uncles or cousins or extended family who may not have the bandwidth to really parent and make sure that they're on the right track. So as the community comes alongside those families, the faith communities come alongside. So I think it's not just one solution, and these young people are in difficult environments, but we know people, and we've been people birthed and reared in difficult environments, but have learned to become resilient. So we need to, pass down that mental and emotional strength that we receive to those children. So we need to get more involved.
Okay. And then Senator Sidnor, do you think that having the county police retirement fund pay monetary judgments awarded to victims of police crimes, would that help deter police violations? And would implementing a policy such as this have a negative impact on how police do their jobs?
I was just having this conversation the other day again. I have a colleague who's going to be introducing, likely introducing legislation dealing with police pensions. And so, I mean, if an officer, I think the way this was explained to me is an officer committed a crime, was convicted of a crime, they could forfeit their pension. I think obviously having that kind of thing hanging over your head probably would deter officers from doing things. But again, you would hope that officers, they're not going to be engaged in criminal conduct anyway. What I guess that's a policy. That's a policy, I guess, that would have to be taken up within the police department if the legislature doesn't do anything like that. But I certainly don't see that as something that is likely to happen.
Okay. All right. So lightning round, last thing. In 2 sentences or less, I would like for you to tell me your number one top priority of what should be done moving forward to make things better in terms of the relationship between the police and the community, starting with Dr. Boyd.
Let's acknowledge that it's not just the job of the police to build this relationship. We need community members to reach out as well. But we also need to push back on other city services, because most cities use the police as a social dumpster to deal with anything they don't want to deal with. And then we get upset when they don't perform well. So building a bridge, one side from the community, the other side from the police. We need both sides together to make this work.
Okay, Captain Lilly.
And I'll piggyback on that. It's a commitment to sharing power and decision-making. I came up with a formula, and the formula essentially is this: the police plus the community multiplied by the balance of enforcement and engagement will dictate the behavior of the server and those being served. And so it is a collective agreement as well as a collective relationship, not just a partnership, because partnerships are transactional. And I think that if we really work on building the bridge, and it's only a bridge if everybody can walk over it, I think that this, for me, is part of my focus right now. It's just establishing that relationship so that we can actively practice that cognitive recognition where we're actively listening to each other as opposed to talking at each other.
Okay, Dr. Debnam.
I would say accountability, from the top down. Also, training. You need to get effective training, not, just with the skill set, but just with their mental and emotional intelligence of options. And also just being aware that they are dealing with people and looking at their community from a people-to-people perspective.
Thank you. Senator Sidnor.
Ultimately, our communities have to, and I think this was mentioned earlier, we need to learn how to love one another and really get to know your neighbors and hopefully try to take law enforcement out of this equation. Communities need to have citizens that are strong, loving, and really just work together.
Well, I actually want to say thank you for ending on the note of love, because this is hosted by Morning Star Baptist Church, and we are about love. And so I just want to say thanks to every single one of you for bringing your time and your talent to bear on this conversation. It was certainly a fabulous and interesting conversation. I'm sure everyone has become better educated as a result of your contributions tonight. And so thank you so much for your time. And with that, I turn it back over to Bishop Debnam.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a great evening, informative, provocative, and it pushed us to really think how we can partner to make our community better and stronger. Let me take a moment to thank our moderator, Dr. Maya Rakimo Cummings, for an outstanding job. Thank you so much for giving your time, your insight tonight. It's been wonderful, To our panelists, thank you all also for sharing your insight and again giving us ideas and of course a path again to some type of stronger bond between police, our community, to make sure that we are better people. To all of our viewers, thank you all so much for sharing your questions, for your engagement, and for pushing us, Morning Star, to offer you opportunities to really get some questions answered and to grow in the same process. So thank you all so much. It's been a great evening. Panelists, we again, thank you, moderator. Thank you so much just for being so insightful on this evening. Well, as we say often, we're closing out just right on time. And so we thank you all so much. Have a great evening, morning. So look forward to seeing you this weekend. Have a great weekend of worship. This is Young Adult Day. So we're looking forward to a great time in the Lord. God bless you all. Take care. Looking forward to seeing you real